I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar, The Neuroscience of Resilience, How Brain Development Affects Learning, Health, and Social Outcomes Across the Lifespan. I'm located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Awandaron peoples. Please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country, should inform our discussions in this webinar and beyond. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nicole Sherren. Dr. Sherren is a PhD graduate in neuroscience from Carleton University with research expertise in experience-based brain development, neurodevelopmental disorders, and brain plasticity. In 2007, Nicole left academia and has focused on mobilizing the science of early brain development, adverse childhood experiences, and resilience into public policy and professional practice. For more than a decade, she has worked directly with professionals across the education, healthcare, justice, and nonprofit sectors to help them embed this science in their workplaces. I'm very pleased to turn it over to Dr. Sherren.
Thank you so much, Linda, and really happy to be here with everyone this morning or this afternoon, wherever you may find yourself in the country, and delighted to spend some time talking to all of you today about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is brain development and how it affects our outcomes across the lifespan. I am an admitted brain chauvinist. I do believe that you are your brain, meaning that every thought you have, every emotion you experience, every behavior that you exhibit, it all comes from, this organ up here in your head. And it turns out that the experiences that we have, particularly in childhood and the environments that we grow and mature in, actually get biologically embedded in this organ, either for good or for ill. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on for you today, is talking about what sorts of experiences set us up for healthy brain development, what sort of experiences derail that developmental process, and what sorts of outcomes we can predict from derailed brain development, and how we can think about addressing those issues either in childhood or in adulthood as well. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about resilience and where resilience research really came from. It started back in the 1970s, and it really focused on looking at different groups, particularly of children who experienced some sort of adversity, and then looking at the groups of children that did well and the groups of children that did not. Now, trait theory was very big in psychological research in the 1970s, and it led people to really think about this idea that there are some children who are essentially invulnerable to adversity. So they're essentially stress resistant. They thrive no matter what you throw at them. And a really sort of not very useful metaphor was developed to describe different types of children and their vulnerability to adversity. So first off, vulnerable children were made of glass, kind of like a glass doll. You hit them with a hammer, they shatter into a million pieces, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't put them back together again. There are some children who are moderately vulnerable. They're sort of like dolls made of plastic. You can hit them with a hammer. There's a little bit of damage, but they certainly don't shatter. But then there was this class of children that was termed invulnerable to adversity. So they were like dolls made of steel. You hit them with a hammer, and they don't break, they don't bend, they don't dent. And what this did for a number of years is really get in the way of our understanding of resilience as a skill and capacity that can be built over time. And starting primarily in the 80s, but also in the early 1990s, a number of advances were made in neuroscience research, as well as in genetics research, that really came together to show that resilience is actually not a lucky trait of children made of steel. It turns out that it's both an outcome and a capacity that can be built over time. So I'm calling this here Resilience 2.0. And what this science has really helped to identify is, what are the key types of conditions or environments that support the development of resilience over time. So you can think about that resilience as a concept as being kind of like a scale where you've got, positive experiences on one side of the scale, negative experiences on the other side of the scale. A resilient outcome means that that scale always tips in the positive direction, even if there's negative weight on the other arm. So this would be a resilient outcome. But when we think about resilience as a capacity that can be built over time, this is more about how you get that scale to tip in the positive direction. And there are three key ways that you can privilege essentially positive outcomes over time. You can think about loading up that positive arm, making it really heavy with all of the supportive, nurturing types of experiences that we know that children need to have to support healthy development. You want to think about not letting too much negative experiences pile up, trying to prevent negative experiences when they do occur, trying to buffer through interventions their impact over time. But the last key aspect of the scale that influences how easy it is to tip it either to the positive or to the negative is this tipping point here, this fulcrum. And you can think about that as kind of like the biology that we're born with. It starts in a different place for everyone. So some people will have that tipping point positioned in a way that privileges positive outcomes. Those positive supports put a lot of weight on the positive side. Some people will have that fulcrum starting in a position that privileges negative outcomes, so gives more weight to what lands on the negative aspect of the scale. But that basic biology, it turns out, is not fixed. It's influenced by the experiences that we have and by the environments that we grow up in. So that means that we can shift this fulcrum over time into a position, hopefully, that privileges positive outcomes across the lifespan. So what I'm going to do for you now is talk a little bit about each one of these principles of resilience and how they work to influence the biology of the brain as we grow and mature. So the first thing I want to talk about is brain development as a very long-term process. So the brain begins developing shortly after conception, but it turns out it doesn't finish developing until we're in our mid to our late 20s. So there's actually a very, very long window in which the brain is uniquely sensitive to experiences and environments that will influence its development over time. And you can think about the process that the brain uses during development as being very similar to the process you would use to build a house. So first off, when you're first starting to build that house, you want to start with a basic blueprint, right? That's going to tell you the relative size and shape of the house, the number of rooms, where they're all located in relationship to one another. But it's not really going to tell you what that house is going to look like at the end of the day. That's going to depend on the finishes that you use inside the house and the furnishings that you put in there. Well, in the same way, the brain also has a basic blueprint that guides the developmental process. That's our genes. But it turns out we've mapped the human genome. We have roughly 23,000 genes in that genome. And it turns out that that is not enough genes to code specifically for every connection between every cell in every neural circuit that we have. So what genes do is really dictate the relative size and shape of the brain, the different locations of different areas of the brain and where the neural circuits are going to be built and the timing of development. But there's a separate process that guides the rest of development over time. And just like where, when you're first building that house, the first thing you want to do is dig a hole, lay a strong foundation, because that has to support all of the visible development that's occurring on top. You guys know that if you get a fault in your foundation, you can potentially put a crack in your roof at some later date. In the same way, during development, the brain is early on laying down, hopefully, a strong foundation of very basic neural circuits that are required to support the development of more complex neural circuitry that emerges over time. You get a fault anywhere in one of those foundational neural circuits, and you can potentially destabilize the development of more complex neural circuits, sometimes years in the future. And again, just like, how the amount of money you can sell that house for at the end of the day is going to depend on the quality of the furnishings and the finishes that you put in there, whether or not you use those high-end marble countertops or the basic Formica. In the same way, the quality of the experiences that we have and the quality of the environments that we grow up in also dictate the quality of the structure of neural circuits that are emerging over time. So high quality experiences and environments equal a high quality structure. Lower quality experiences and environments also equal a lower quality structure. So keep this particular concept in mind through the rest of the presentation, because this concept applies over the course of roughly 2.5 decades worth of development. Now, when neural circuits first start wiring up, what happens is there is a genetic signal that comes out saying when neural circuits need to start wiring together. And this happens in a process of overproduction. So again, we don't have enough genes to specifically code for every one of those connections that gets made as neural circuits are wiring up. So what happens is the brain overproduces a number of connections, and the cells all start talking to each other within the neural circuit. And you can see that depicted here with 3 representative neural circuits on this graph. So what you have here along the vertical axis is the number of connections being formed between cells. And what you have along the bottom here is age. So the prenatal period, the first year of life, and then age out to 19. And so the first set of neural circuits that are developing in this particular schematic are represented by the orange line. These are our sensory systems. So what you're seeing here is just around that perinatal period, a steep uptick in connectivity between the cells in our sensory systems. Now, our sensory systems, even though they are reasonably complex, they're a pretty basic set of neural circuits, and they're important to have online just around the time of birth, because they are the way that we are able to take in information about the world around us so that we can eventually learn to react to it in some way. But the key takeaway here is that those sensory systems are supporting the development of the next more complex neural circuit in this particular graph, represented by the blue line here. These are language skills. Those language skills are heavily dependent on inputs from our auditory system. We know that if babies can't hear spoken language, that those language circuits are not going to develop in the most optimal way that we would like them to develop, which is why it's really important for babies to have early auditory testing. Because if we know that a little baby can't hear appropriately, we could potentially get in there and intervene in ways that will help keep those language circuits on their best developmental track. And then the last set of neural circuits that are developing in this particular graph are represented here by the red line. These are called higher cognitive functions. Things like being able to pay attention, remember and follow lots of rules, get along with our peers. And the key thing here is that they are also dependent on appropriate development of our sensory systems, so being able to take in information from the world around us so that we can react to it in some way, and also in many cases on our ability to communicate with other people, so those language systems as well. We are a social species. We grow and live in groups, and those social interactions are really critical in shaping some of those higher cognitive functions over time. So you get a fault in any one of those earlier neural circuits, you can potentially destabilize ever more complex neural circuitry as we continue to mature. Now, the other key takeaway that you're noticing from this particular graphic is a steep drop-off in connections between the cells and neural circuits over time. It turns out that more is not always better when it comes to connections between cells. What's going on here is a normal developmental process that's called pruning. It's the way in which the brain creates speed and efficiency in processing information in neural circuits. And the reason why pruning is such an important process during development is because it is experience dependent. It essentially happens in a use it or lose it kind of fashion. So remember when I said that, the brain typically overproduces connections when cells are first starting to wire up. As we start to use that neural circuit by practicing whatever sort of skill or ability it supports, what happens is certain connections in the neural circuit start to get used a lot. And those get very strong and stable and remain typically over the lifespan of the circuit. The connections that don't get used very often, the brain figures, you know what? Maybe those ones aren't very helpful for the neural circuit. We didn't have a perfect plan and when we first laid out all of these connections. So those connections get weaker and weaker, and they eventually get pruned away. They disappear from the neural circuit over time. So pruning is an incredibly important use it or lose it process. And this is what it actually looks like in the human brain. So what I have for you here is a very thin slice through a particular area of the cortex at birth, 3 years, and 14 years of age. And all of these little blobby bits in each one of these images represents the body of a cell. And all of the long lines coming off of those bodies are called axons and dendrites. They are the places where the cells make the most connections with other cells around them. So the more long lines in an image like this, the more connections between the cells in the circuit. So what you'll notice here is that at birth, there are very few connections between the cells. This circuit's not yet wired up. By 3 years of age, there's been a huge explosion of connections between the cells. So this circuit is now, functional and starting to wire up. But by 14 years of age, maybe as many as 50 to 60% of those connections have now been removed from the circuit. But this is the more mature configuration of this neural circuit. We are going to be faster and better at doing whatever this neural circuit does at 14 years than we were at 3 years of age. So what does this actually mean then when we think about environments that children are growing up in? Well, I'll give you 2 extreme examples of how different types of environments can shape this pruning process in key ways. In the first example, imagine a child growing up in a stable 2-parent family. There's access to high quality childcare when the parents are away. The child has lots of opportunities to practice their early language and literacy skills, lots of adults who are speaking to them and encouraging them to speak, reading to them and encouraging them to read. Lots of opportunity for that child to get together and play with their peers and practice learning how to get along, knowing that when you punch little Johnny in the shoulder, maybe he won't like that and won't want to play with you. So you need to control those urges. And when this child is upset, they have lots of adult support to help teach them how to calm their emotions and ensure that they're appropriate for whatever situation at hand. And once this child gets into the school system, there's lots of teachers who are there in classrooms who can spend a lot of one-on-one with each child in their class. So this child is having a set of experiences that is helping to shape pro-social neural circuits and strengthen them over time. This child is getting lots of opportunity, again, to practice early language and literacy, lots of opportunity to practice their social skills in terms of getting along with peers, lots of opportunity to practice good emotional control. That's going to strengthen those underlying circuits in the brain and essentially set this child up, barring any sort of future calamity, to do reasonably well as they get into the school system and as they continue to grow and mature and on into adulthood. Now imagine a child growing up in a different sort of environment. There is substance use on the part of both parents and domestic violence within the home. There is no high quality childcare for that child when the parents are out. I mean, they do try and get the lady down the hall to look after their kid if they're not going to be there, but if she's not available, they might leave their child home for long periods of time. There aren't a lot of other kids in this neighborhood, and nobody's bothering to get that child together deliberately with their peers on a regular basis. There's a playground down the street, but you know what? It's full of gang activity and drug dealing, so it's not a safe place for kids to go and to play. And once that child gets into the school system, the teachers are all busy, and so they don't have a lot of time to spend one-on-one time with each child in their class. So how does this environment shape the developmental neural circuits in this particular child? Well, this child is likely practicing a lot of behaviors involved in fear-based reactions. So it's a scary thing, you know, when mommy and daddy are drinking and fighting. They are likely getting lots of opportunities to practice behaviors that are angry behaviors or aggressive behaviors, because this is what they're seeing in their home. This is what they have to emulate. And the flip side of this is, what is this child not getting the opportunity to practice? Well, they're probably not getting the same opportunity to practice early language and literacy, right? Because nobody's paying a lot of attention to that child. They are not getting the same opportunity to practice those social skills that will help them learn to get along with their peers. And they are also likely not getting the opportunity to practice good emotional control, because when they are upset, it's often because the adults around them are causing that upset, and they are then preoccupied with whatever it is that they're doing and not paying attention to their child and helping coach them on how to control their own emotions. So in these two extreme examples, what you can see is the first child, because of that environment, likely set up to do reasonably well as they grow and mature. And the second child, in the absence of any intervention, potentially being set up to likely not do well as they continue to grow and mature. So that pruning process, again, is incredibly important when we think about how environments shape our neural circuitry over time. Now, I've used the word experiences a lot. I do want to talk about what kinds of experiences are the most important to have during the developmental period. And it turns out that there's only one type of experience where, if it's absent in the developmental period, where we can get deficits across multiple functional domains in kids. And it turns out that this is a social interaction. So we often liken this as being kind of like a serve and return that goes on between a child and a responsive adult. And what it looks like is the child serves up some bid for interaction or communication. We, as the responsive adult, need to recognize the child as serving and return that serve in a developmentally appropriate way, and also in a way that hopefully keeps that interaction going back and forth for a period of time, kind of like two people passing a ball back and forth. And the purpose of these social interactions, particularly early in development, is to give children the opportunity to practice, and strengthen the underlying neural circuitry that supports pro-social, cognitive, social, and emotional skills. So serve and return style social interactions are going to look very different depending on the age and stage of a child. You know, when it's a little baby, it could look like playing peekaboo, or it could look like, you know, your baby's in their crib and they're looking at a stuffy toy that's sitting on the floor outside the crib. Well, they're paying attention to that what do? We notice that, we pick it up and we bring it in front of the baby's face, right? And they interact with it briefly. They're, this is interesting. Maybe they shove it in their mouth and that sort of thing. And then what happens? Well, they look away, right? And what do? Well, we whip it back in front of their face and try and, get them to pay attention to it again. And they do for a brief period of time, and they look away. And we keep doing that until that baby starts to look a bit fussy, like, get that thing out of my face. I don't want to see it anymore. And then we know that that interaction is over. We wait for a new serve. And the purpose of that particular example, what skill that is building in a very, very young child, a baby that's less than a year old, is focused attention. So attention is a really important skill that we need to cultivate over time. And babies can't pay attention to things for very long when they're really young, but with practice, they will learn to focus their attention, pay attention for longer periods of time, and filter out all of the distractions. That is ultimately a fairly complex skill set that we're building on through these basic types of interactions. And as kids get older, of course, it could look like conversations that go back and forth, singing a song, playing a game, reading a book, helping your child get through a temper tantrum. That would be a serve and return style interaction. As kids get even older, it could look like helping them think about long-term goals and how they might achieve them. So, your tween thinking about, do I really have to take math all the way through high school? Well, maybe you should consider that if you aren't sure whether or not you're going to go to university, or whether or not, what program you might see yourself in if you do. Helping your teenager get through the first time they get dumped in a romantic relationship can also be considered a serve and return style social interaction. Coping with rejection is hopefully not a skill that we need all of the time, but it's a good skill to have. We're all going to need it at some point or another. So all of those are serve and return style social interactions, and they are critical during that developmental period in terms of giving us the opportunities to practice ever more complex skill sets that emerge over time. Now, what are some of the most important skills that we want to, develop in that developmental period? Well, some of the most important skill sets that we have, we often liken them to core life skills, is really executive function and self-regulation. And so it's often helpful to think about executive function as being kind of like an air traffic control system in the brain. It's not one skill set. It's actually a whole host of skills that work together that help us navigate through complex physical, social, and emotional environments. So if you think about, sort of like what an air traffic controller needs to do when they're sitting up there in their tower, and having all those planes, trying to take off and land all at the same time. Well, they have to be able to pay attention to and monitor a whole bunch of different banks of radar screens, make sure none of those blips are getting too close together. They have to be able to remember and follow long lists of rules, right? Different protocols for different weather conditions. If it's clear and sunny, you might have all of your runways open, but if there's a sudden weather front that moves in, the clouds roll in, you start to get gusty winds from the northwest, well, maybe you're going to have to shut one of those runways and reroute everyone into a different landing pattern. They have to be able to shift on the fly when the information changes. Oh my God, a new blip just showed up on the screen. This is a new flight from Denver coming in that nobody told us about. And now maybe what you have to do is reorder everybody's landing pattern, because you have to land that new plane before it runs out of fuel. And you have to be able to do all of this while controlling what's going on for you emotionally and ensuring that it's appropriate for the situation at hand. Air traffic control is a high stress job, but it doesn't do to have emotional outbursts in the workplace. And that's essentially what executive function is doing for us on a regular basis. So if you want to think about sort of 4 cardinal skills in executive function, particularly in children, you can think about the top 4 on this list here. Working memory, or the ability to hold information in our minds and manipulate it over the short term. Working memory is a key skill set involved in remembering and following rules, which is, of course, really important for kids as they are, particularly when they're very young, but as they grow and mature. The second one, delayed gratification or impulse control. This is our ability to control our desire to do something that we might really, really want to do in favor of doing something that might be somewhat less than thrilling. It's a key skill set involved in goal-directed behavior. The third one is cognitive flexibility, or our ability to shift on the fly or shift in response to some feedback that we're getting. It's a key skill set involved in problem solving. And again, that self-regulation, or sometimes called emotional regulation piece, our ability to control our emotions and ensure that they're appropriate for the situation at hand. And when executive function is working well, it's pretty much invisible. I mean, you don't notice it at all. It's just running in the background for all of us. It's when it's not working well that we can start to see problems in kids as well, by the way, in adults. And the reason why executive function is considered one of those core life skills is because it does predict 3 key outcomes for us across the lifespan. So the first outcome that executive function predicts for us is academic success. So not necessarily our ability to get good grades and go on to post-secondary. This is more about our ability to graduate from high school versus dropping out or flunking out. So what is it that kids need to do in order to get their high school diploma? Well, first off, they have to actually go to school in the first place. They have to be a bum in the seat. So go to their English class rather than, cut class and go to the skateboarding park. That's delayed gratification. They have to be able to complete their assignments on time and as asked, as well as potentially respond to the teacher's feedback on those assignments. That would be working memory, cognitive flexibility. They have to be able to get along with the other kids in school, get along with the teacher as well. And that would be a key part of emotional regulation or self-regulation. So all of those are executive function skills, and they're critically important in terms of high school graduation. The second key outcome that executive function predicts for us is employment success. So what are employers looking for in terms of a good employee? Well, they want someone who's going to show up for work on time on a regular basis, right? They want someone who's going to complete their assignments on time and as asked. They want someone who can get along with their colleagues, get along with their boss. They also maybe want somebody who can get along with the customer base if it's a forward-facing job. They want people who can be creative problem solvers and take on leadership roles when they need to. All of those are executive function skills. So incredibly important when we think about the ability to succeed in our employment or in a career. And the last key outcome that executive function predicts for us is in some ways the most important one of all. It also predicts our ability to successfully parent our own kids. So I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar today are parents themselves. Think about what it takes to be able to successfully parent a child or more than one child. You have to be able to remember and follow lots of routines, right? You also have to be able to shift on the fly when the routine changes, because the routine always changes at some point or another. You have to be able to actively problem solve for the various things that come up. You have to be able to put your child's needs in front of your own. And you also have to be able to control your emotions, particularly when your child is having trouble controlling theirs. So all of those are executive function skills, and they're critically important when we think about successful parenting of the next generation. Now, it turns out that executive function is located in the area of the brain that is behind the forehead and our eyes. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And what I have for you here is a composite MRI map of the developing cortex over time from age 5 down through age 20. What you see up across the top is a right-hand view of the developing cortex. That means that this would be the nose and this would be the back of the head. And what you have down here is a top view of that developing cortex. This would be the nose up here at the top, and the back of the head would be at the bottom. And in this particular composite image, The pinky red areas are the least developed areas. The blue areas are the most developed areas. And so what you'll notice here is sort of this gradual back to front maturational process, which is going on over time. And it's this area here behind our forehead and our eyes, the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of our executive functions. That is the area of the cortex that matures last. So that means that there's a very, very long window of time in which our executive functions are exquisitely sensitive to experiences and environments. It doesn't mean that they don't remain sensitive. They do. The brain does retain its ability to change over time, but that developmental window is the area in which they are the most sensitive. So that means there's a really long window in which we have to intervene and shore up those skill sets if kids haven't had the opportunity to practice them. Now, there's one other way that serve and return style social interactions affect our biology, and it's through gene expression. This comes from the area of research called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how we control the expression of genes in all of our cells. Now, you might think, well, why the heck do we need to control gene expression? Now, remember when I told you that we've mapped the human genome, we have roughly 23,000 genes in that genome. And if you hearken back to the last time you took a biology class, hopefully you'll remember that every single cell in our bodies has a copy, technically 2 copies, but still a copy of every single one of those roughly 23,000 genes. But not all the cells in our body look the same, right? We've got brain cells, we've got blood cells, heart cells, liver cells, skin cells. And all of those cells look different and they perform different functions because it turns out they have different subsets of those 23,000 genes, either turned on or expressed or turned off, and so not expressed. So we've known about differential gene expression, and how it factors into creating different cell types in the body for some time. What's new in terms of gene expression and how it affects our biology is a more recent discovery that the postnatal experiences that we have, so after we are born, after all of our cells have differentiated, those experiences that we have in those environments that we grow up in can also alter gene expression in particular sensitive windows of development, particularly early on in development. And we believe that this is sort of an evolutionary mechanism wherein our biology is trying to help set us up to do well in the environments that we're born into. And so this research really comes from the early 1990s. It's also Canadian research, came from Michael Meany's lab at McGill University. And what they had was a very interesting natural experiment and serendipitous finding that allowed them to discover differential gene expression as a result of different types of environments growing up. What they had was a large breeding colony of rats at McGill. And they were looking at different types of environments that these rats were growing up in. But what they discovered just through observation was they had a couple of different naturally occurring types of rat mothers in this breeding colony. Now I'm going to say mothers here a number of times. I do want any of the men on this webinar to know that this is not about the sex or gender of the person providing care for babies. These experiments have been replicated in other species that do show paternal care, including in humans. It just so happens that rats don't show paternal care. You put that rat dad in the cage with his babies and he ignores them, they'll step on them and that sort of thing. They don't bother with the care. But so what they noticed was they had 2 sort of extreme types of naturally occurring rat mums in the colony. The first group of mums they called the super mums. So these were rat mothers who spent a lot of time interacting with their pups. So how does a rat mother show her love to her pup? Well, rat pups are born about the size of my thumb. They're hairless. They can't thermoregulate. And so what the rat mother does is she snuggles them against her belly all the time. She licks and grooms them a lot. And when one of them sort of scurries out of the nest, she goes and retrieves it right away. Then they had another group, just naturally occurring mums, who were not neglectful mums, but they were measurably different in the amount of time and the number of interactions that they had with their pups. So all of their pups thrived and survived into adulthood, but these mums didn't lick and groom nearly as often, didn't spend as much time snuggling their pups against their belly. And when one of them scurried out of the nest, she'd be like, you can come back when you're cold. She wouldn't go and retrieve them very often. And then they had a whole bunch of rats mums in the middle who were sort of providing an average amount of care. So what they did was they studied the offspring of the super mums and the less interactive mums. They allowed these pups to grow up into adulthood, and they tested them on a number of different types of mazes to see whether or not there was any influence of that type of environment, that naturally occurring environment, on their behavior. And what they found, to their surprise, was the rats who came from the low quality care condition, when faced with a challenging or stressful type of situation, had a much, much higher reaction to that situation than rats from the higher quality care condition. And they measured this by looking at the level of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, in the bloodstream of these rats. So the rats who had grown up with low quality care had much higher levels of cortisol, which persisted for much longer periods of time when faced with a challenging or stressful situation. Now, here's where the serendipity comes in. It turns out that one of Michael's colleagues down the hall was a geneticist. And when he was talking about this unexpected finding, his colleague said, well, why don't we look at the pattern of gene expression to see if that had anything to do with this type of behavior? And he thought, well, I guess we can. I don't think that would, be the case, but sure, why not? Let's go for it. And what they found was a key sort of biological marker, a little chemical compound that was sitting right on top of one of the genes involved in the stress response system in the brain, essentially blocking that gene from the cellular machinery that could turn it on. So essentially, this gene was not expressed in the same way that it was in the rats from the high quality care condition. So there was a genetic change in terms of gene expression, which from a functional capacity ended up sensitizing those rats' stress response systems and making them overreact to the challenges that they were experiencing in their environments. Now, it turns out that these kinds of genetic changes are typically, once they occur, persistent across the lifespan. So once they occur, they don't tend to change back. If you think about this from a cell differentiation type of perspective, it kind of makes sense. You don't want your red blood cells spontaneously transforming into bone cells, right? That wouldn't be very good for you. And it turns out these postnatal changes in gene expression also tend to be persistent across the lifespan. And again, we think that it's our biology's way of setting us up to do well in the environments that we're born into. If you're a social species like the rat or like the human, you are typically living in groups of people, and you are typically sharing the sort of tasks of getting food, of keeping watch for danger. You have social interactions that support your well-being over time, that support your ability to have children and support the next generation. But if you're getting a signal very early in development that you actually don't have a lot of social support, it might actually be adaptive for you to actually become a little bit more vigilant in your environment, become a little bit more reactive to some of the perceived threats, because you don't have anyone watching your back, right? If you experience a challenge, you're going to be on your own. The issue, though, becomes when there's a mismatch between the environments that we're born into and the environments that we grow up in. Now, for the rat, they only live about 2 years, either in the laboratory or in the wild, but humans live much longer than that. There are likely to be mismatches between the environments that we're born into and the environments that we end up in over time. And that's where some of these changes ultimately can become maladaptive. So somebody who has experienced some of these genetic changes or changes in gene expression that make them a little bit more hypervigilant in their environments, a little bit more sensitive to perceived threats, that can potentially undermine our ability to support good supportive social interactions that we know are going to be important for our well-being over time, right? So on the one hand, adaptive, on the other hand, when there's a mismatch, maladaptive. And it turns out that research has shown that not only do these changes typically persist across the lifespan, they're also potentially heritable. We can pass them down to the next generation. And this is what we now believe to be at least one aspect, one biological aspect of intergenerational trauma. And so it's not just about the environments that we grow up in, it's also about the genetic legacy and that gene expression, that pattern of gene expression that potentially gets passed down from generation to generation that can potentially make us vulnerable regardless of the environment that we grow up in. Now, we've seen this persistence out to at least 5 generations in animal research. We've only yet seen it out to 1 generation in human research because, of course, we need natural experiments to do these studies in humans. But if any of you work with Indigenous peoples, you will have probably heard elders talk about the fact that it takes 7 generations to work through historical trauma. They're not basing their understanding of this, of course, on epigenetics. They're basing it on that sort of that wisdom that has been passed down to them from generation to generation, noting that trauma that occurs in previous generations has an effect over the long term. Okay, so there's one last player in the development of the brain, and that's stress. But it turns out that not all stress is the same. It's important to think about stress in different ways in terms of how it supports or derails healthy brain development over time. So the first kind of stress that I want to talk about is called positive stress. This is a brief activation of the stress response system. It's required for healthy brain development. What happens is stress hormones go up briefly, they come back to baseline pretty quickly. And what positive stress looks like is typically a developmentally appropriate challenge that gives children the opportunity to practice their stress coping skills. So we often think about positive stress for most kids being things like the first day of school, maybe getting an immunization, that kind of thing. And it's, again, really critical because it will strengthen the underlying neural circuitry that will support the development of ever more complex stress coping skills as we continue to mature. The next kind of stress is called tolerable stress. So this is a more serious activation of the stress response system. But the key with tolerable stress is that we have access to stable, supportive adult relationships that help us buffer our response to that stress. So essentially, that supportive adult acts like an external stress response system for the child. They help that child soothe their fears, calm their emotions, bring those stress hormones back down to baseline much quicker than they might have otherwise come back down, and can also help to scaffold or coach those coping skills, help the child with their coping skills, potentially teach them a more complex coping skill if they're ready for that, and help model and coach that for the child. So in that way, tolerable stress doesn't typically leave a lasting impact on our biology. But the last kind of stress is called toxic stress. It is the bad guy in terms of brain development. Toxic stress is essentially a prolonged activation of the stress response system. But the key here is that it's in the absence of supportive adult relationships. So there is not enough support to buffer the child's response to the stress. That means that stress hormones go high and they remain high for long periods of time. Now, the best studied types of toxic stress are things like child maltreatment, neglect, various forms of family dysfunction, including substance abuse in the home, domestic violence in the home, family violence in the home, even separation and divorce as well. So toxic stress is not limited to that, but those are often the most studied types. But it could also be exposure to community violence, unstable housing, chronic bullying, racism and discrimination. All of those things also can produce a toxic stress response in a child. Now, how does toxic stress get biologically embedded? Well, there's three key ways, but first off, it's important to understand how the stress response system works and what it's meant to do. So the stress response system is a brain circuit, so I want to emphasize that. It's also a circuit that's evolutionarily conserved. That means that this picture here that I have for you is a diagram of the human stress response circuit, but every mammal has a stress response circuit that looks almost identical to the one in the picture. So what happens when we perceive a threat in the environment is a signal is sent out from an area of the midbrain that will start a cascade of reactions that will end up dumping stress hormones into our bodies. And those stress hormones essentially allow us to, do a fight or flight type of response. So there's two major types of stress hormones that get released. They both do slightly different things. The first one I'm just going to call adrenaline. That is the sort of the more common term for it. What adrenaline does for us is it gets our heart rate up, gets us breathing faster, shunts all sorts of energy out to our muscles, and essentially readies us to explode into some kind of reaction, right? But there's another type of stress hormone that I'm sure everyone's heard of as well. That's cortisol. Cortisol also gets released, but it does something slightly different from adrenaline. What it does is it helps us preferentially store fat, because fat is the richest source of energy in the human body. And fat storage will help us maintain higher levels of activity over longer periods of time if we need to. It suppresses some parts of our immune system, so our innate and acquired immunity, because the immune system is an energy hogging system and it's a bit of a trade-off. You're better off shunting that energy into your muscles in the short term so that you can flee or fight whatever it is that you're facing and get a cold 10 days from now than, fighting off the cold now, but maybe not escaping whatever it is, the bear that you're trying to escape from. But it also activates other parts of our immune system. So these are inflammatory pathways. Inflammatory pathways are actually really critical in terms of killing off invading bacteria that get under our skin and speeding wound healing. So if you think about this from the point of view of if you ever had to run from a bear, this might be a really important thing to have activated. If that bear reaches out and mauls you with its claws, or if you slip and fall into a ditch and scrape up your skin, well, it would be good for you to be able to fight off whatever bacteria gets in there and speed up that wound healing over time. But the last thing that cortisol does in terms of the stress response is it crosses back into the brain, interacts at multiple levels along the stress response circuit, and shuts down hormone production. So it's called a negative feedback loop. So cortisol gets secreted in response to stress, but then it crosses back into the brain and shuts down the production of stress hormones when that stress is gone. So how does this system get dysregulated when we're under chronic stress, that sort of toxic stress that's occurring over the long term? Well, again, three main ways. The first way involves the wear and tear on our peripheral systems, like our cardiovascular system, our metabolic system, and our immune system. Those systems are not meant to be jacked up and dialed back and jacked up and dialed back all of the time. And so what happens is over time, that constant up and down starts to damage some of those cells. And that damage typically doesn't get repaired. It accumulates over time. You couple that with a nonspecific inflammatory response, which can also attack some of the cells in the system. And what you get is a gradual weakening of those cells and potential vulnerability, sometimes even decades into the future, in terms of disorders that are involved with those systems. So cardiac disease, stroke, autoimmune disorders, that type of thing. The next two ways that toxic stress gets biologically embedded involves the interactions of cortisol on the developing brain. So there are a number of different receptive fields for cortisol in the developing brain. The first one I want to talk about is here. This is the prefrontal cortex. Recall, it's the seat of our executive functions. What cortisol is doing when we're under threat, when we're facing some kind of challenge in our environment, is it interacts with cells here to dampen down our ability to use our executive functions. Now, keep in mind, this is an evolutionarily conserved system, which is really designed to help us with, short-term, immediate types of threats. So what's going on here is, if, for example, a bear jumped out from behind a tree, and you had to make a snap decision in terms of, are you going to run or are you going to try and grab a stick and beat that bear off? What cortisol is doing by interacting with your prefrontal cortex is helping you not to overthink your response. It's not adaptive for you to think, oh my God, what should I do? Maybe I'll get out a piece of paper and write pro and con at the top and think carefully about my plan. No, you need to be reverting to a more reactive behavioral repertoire. That's what cortisol is helping you do. But when cortisol is washing through that area of the brain on a regular basis, when we are trying to use those skills on a regular basis to ensure that the neural circuitry that supports them gets nice and strong and stable, what can happen is we can potentially derail the development of more complex executive functions, right? Because we're not using them in the way that we should be. And the last area of the brain that's affected by cortisol is the stress response system itself. So when cortisol interacts with cells there to signal a shutdown of hormone production, it makes those cells in the circuit fire. So it interacts with the first cell in the circuit, it fires, sending a signal down to the second cell in the circuit and on down the chain. But those cells are also not meant to be active all of the time. And when they are overactivated, what happens is they start to remove their connections from other cells in the circuit. It is a sort of a survival mechanism for these cells. If they remain active over the long term, they will eventually get damaged. They can potentially die. But unlike the cells in our periphery, our brain cells, remember, are plastic and they change in response to experiences. So that experience of getting bombarded with cortisol makes those cells change. They remove their connections. They don't have to send as strong of a signal. So good for the cell, but overall bad for the circuit. Because of course, what happens then is that the signal to shut down hormone production gets weaker and weaker. And what that means is we'll end up with more cortisol circulating all of the time. So again, this idea of a vicious cycle, the more cortisol you have circulating, the harder it's going to be trying to shut down its own production, the less efficient we get at shutting down cortisol production over time. Okay, so just a couple of short and long-term outcomes associated with early adversity before we wrap up. There are a number of studies that have looked at outcomes associated with toxic stress, things like experiencing, witnessing domestic violence, having substance abusing parents, having a parent with an untreated mental illness, or child abuse or neglect. And it turns out that when this occurs very early in development, before the first 3 years of age, there can be a pretty significant impact on the development of just, those normal basic skills and abilities. So in this particular graph here, what you see is data from just over 1,000 children in the child protection system in the US. what these researchers did was they looked at these children at 3 years of age. So that means that every child at 3 years of age had a substantiated claim of child abuse in their file. And what they did was they tested them on a standard 5-domain developmental task. And then they looked at the number of types of adversity these kids had experienced. This isn't a frequency count. It's the number of types. So whether or not you had been physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, or witnessed domestic violence, etc. And then they just looked at the number of kids who failed in at least one developmental domain. And what you can see here is a dose-response relationship between the number of types of adversity and whether or not these kids were doing well developmentally at 3 years of age. Such that by the time you get up to 6 or 7 types of adversity, almost 100% of these kids were showing developmental delays. And the reason why I think this particular example or study is important to talk about is to just remind you that these children were assessed at 3 years, which means that whatever happened to them occurred before 3 years of age, which means that a number of these kids were likely not able to remember what had happened to them. So we don't need to remember what happens to us in order for it to have an impact on our biology. These next 2 graphs come from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which I'm sure a number of you have heard about. It's one of the largest studies that's ever been done, linking adversity in the early years before the age of 18 to health outcomes in middle age. And so this was a partnership between the Centers for Disease Control at Atlanta and a big HMO in California called Kaiser Permanente. They asked over 17,000 middle-class, middle-aged, mostly Caucasian, educated, married, all with health insurance people coming in for their periodic health exam, if they would answer a 10-item questionnaire about childhood experiences. And the 10 items on that questionnaire were, did you ever experience before the age of 18 physical neglect, emotional neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse? Was anyone in your home a substance abuser? Did anyone in your home have an untreated mental illness? Did you witness domestic violence? Was anyone in your household ever incarcerated? And did you ever lose a parent for any reason, including separation or divorce? And if you answered a yes, you scored a 1. If you answered a no, you scored a 0. They added up the score out of 10 and they called it the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE score. And because they had healthcare records, what they did was they just lined up the ACE score with the healthcare records in this population. So what you see is the ACE score here along the bottom and the risk along the side here of a particular type of outcome. So this is the risk for a depressive disorder in adulthood. And as you can see, this dose-response relationship, as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for experiencing depression during adulthood. Now, there are a number of paths to depression that we know about. There are certain types of depression that run in families and have more of a genetic basis, but we also know that experiencing adversity in childhood can dysregulate our stress response system, can impair our ability to control our emotions and to have those core life skills that help us maintain relationships that we all know are protective factors in depression as well. This is the risk for substance use disorders in adult per ACE score. So alcoholism or an illicit drug use. And again, you can see this dose-response relationship of increases in these types of outcomes as the ACE score increases. And just like for depression, we do know that addiction runs in families. There are certain genes that can make us vulnerable, but we also know that people who have trouble coping with stress, who don't have very good problem solving or judgment skills are at risk for developing addiction over time, right? They self-medicate because maybe they have depression or anxiety. That self-medication can work in the short term, but in the long term can produce an additional problem. And not just from the adverse childhood experiences study, but from a number of different studies now over the past 2 decades, what we found is that toxic stress affects the brain and behavior to influence a whole host of different outcomes. So poor academic achievement, behavioral problems in kids, addiction, mental illness, and suicide attempts, risky sexual behavior, family violence, separation and divorce, unstable employment, homelessness, criminal behavior, almost any type of chronic disease that you can think of, but primarily, cardiovascular, metabolic, immune, chronic pain, memory loss, including dementia, as well as potentially early death. So while that does sound like a lot of bad news, and certainly within the confines of the original California ACEs study, what they found is fully 2/3 of their population answered yes to at least one ACE. Means that ACEs are actually very common in the general population. It turns out that not everyone who has ACEs has a bad outcome. These are risk factors. They are not guarantees of bad outcomes. So what does this mean when we now go back and think about resilience as a concept? Well, keep in mind that active ingredient in resilience building is the presence of stable, supportive relationships that essentially scaffold those coping skills and buffer the impact of the toxic stress that we experience, not just in childhood, but also in adulthood as well. For any of you who actually provide talk therapy or are familiar with talk therapy, think about talk therapy as being, one of the great epitomes of this. What are you trying to do within the context of that supportive relationship? You're trying to help people build their strengths, right? Build those positive supports. You're trying to buffer the impact of the negative experiences that they've had over the course of their lifespan. And you're also trying to help them build skills and abilities over time, strengthen those skill sets if they never had the chance to do that early on in development. And so when we think about resilience that way, we can think about this idea of those adults, no matter when, across the lifespan, helping to shift that fulcrum or tipping point into a position that will favor positive outcomes over time. Oops. And the last thing that I want to point out for you is that it's never too late to build resilience. The brain retains its capacity to change in response to experiences and environments. But yes, guess what? That ability is highest in the early years. That means it's easier, faster, and cheaper to get it right the first time. But for anyone who's over 30, thankfully, that capacity to change never goes to zero. But what does happen is that the amount of effort required to make change will increase, the amount of resources, the amount of time required to make change increases as well. And so just in the last couple of minutes, Linda mentioned that over the past 15 years or so, I have been working with people who have pivoted to thinking about how you can apply this science in key ways, either to support frontline practice, programming, or organizations. And so I just wanted to share a few lessons learned from that work to give you, some food for thought about how you might think about this science as well. So first off, this science of resilience and the science of brain development has really helped to shift people's mental models, which are ultimately the necessary precursors of behavior and practice change. So that means that it helps to shift people's attitudes and beliefs about why people show up the way they do, reduces the stigma around things like mental illness, substance use, or domestic violence, right? Or criminal behavior. So really, really important in thinking about that as a key starting point for thinking about how you want to go about applying this. You need to shift people's beliefs before they can actually make any sort of other change. It creates understanding, engagement, and motivation for change in clients. So from organizations who have started sharing this with clients, what they've reported is that it reduces self-blame measurably. And it helps people to understand better why they're where they're at, and why they need certain types of programming to support them. ACEs are important, and a lot of people, that grabs their attention, they pivot to that. But ultimately, the approach that most people do take is strengths-based approaches. So don't forget to focus on all aspects of resilience, not just ACEs, but also on those positive supports and those skill building opportunities. If you want to think about getting people to engage and apply this science sort of more at a practice or program level, it's important to give people time to make sense of it, right? What does this really mean in the context of what we're doing here? And it's that sense-making time, which is really fundamental in helping people to understand how you can apply this in new and innovative ways. And of course, it's also important to build continuous evaluation into that process. You want to be able to know whether or not, if you are shifting your practice, whether or not that's improving your outcome. In terms of system change approaches, addressing complex social issues. I know that many people here are involved in the family violence sector. This is a complex social issue, and it requires a system and even a multi-system approach. And so sharing this science as a key step in supporting a system level or multi-system level approach is really critical, because it helps to create a common language and understanding of those complex social issues across sectors. Everyone can sort of see themselves in this science. And of course, it then provides that foundation for thinking about common goals and collective action around an issue. And it can also essentially help to create the capacity of the system to support innovation and change by cultivating new champions for the work, new change agents. And that ultimately increases the impact of any sort of larger system change approach. And I'm sorry, I went a few minutes over, but I hope you enjoyed that presentation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some questions and answering some questions for people.
Oh, Dr. Nicole Sherren, thank you very much. And we have many questions. So you can see, Nicole, I now have my glasses on, my scarf is off, so we're ready to go. I wanted to start with you and I, before the webinar started, we were chatting about the realities of the pandemic, and I'm in Ontario and you're in Alberta. And one group of questions that came in really centered around the pandemic. And we know people have been in lockdowns in some territories and districts at some point, sometimes quite a few times. They've been cut off from support. Parents have been stressed. Young people have been stressed. Multitasking, perhaps in some ways, in some families, more time with children, in others, a lot less time. Some people still having to go out to work and face all sorts of fears. And the questions are, what do you think? Has COVID-19, based on your knowledge of neurodevelopment, has it been a tolerable stress, a toxic stress? And what about different age groups? What about infants, who, individuals who were infants during this pandemic versus different developmental stages? Or is it just dependent on what kind of an environment you were situated in during the pandemic? So lots of questions around that. I've thrown out lots of things and just invite you to comment.
Sure. I did a presentation, I think it was maybe 3 months into the pandemic, where somebody asked that. And at the time, we were thinking, well, maybe it's not going to last that long. And maybe it'll be about a year, but it's not too bad. So, I think my opinion now is a little bit different than it was then, because even though you might not be in an environment where we've gone through multiple sort of lockdowns and openings and lockdowns and openings, the uncertainty for people, I think, has been really critical. And I think it's affected all of our mental health. But there are some people, I think, and kids as well, who've been well supported through this. and who are actually going to be able to cope quite well. So the pandemic will be more like a tolerable stress for them. So these are folks wherein their parents didn't necessarily lose their jobs, right? Or they were able to cope well with Zoom school, that kind of thing. So there weren't additional stresses on the family. And I think for people who had sort of high capacity for resilience in the first place, they were set up to cope with this reasonably well, barring having a complete calamity happen to them as a result of the pandemic. But I think there's going to be a lot of people for whom this is going to leave a bit of more of a lasting impression. So, you've had adults who have struggled with this, and these are parents, right? So when your parent is struggling, sometimes that has an impact on the child too, even if the parent can do a lot of things, right? But when parents are highly anxious about what's happening for them and what's happening in the environment, that can get communicated to their child. Not every parent is as good at Zoom school as other people are. And so some kids, I think, have fallen behind. I know that certainly within the education system here, this has been a key concern, that a lot of kids are falling behind. But I think the biggest impact is going to be felt on families who were struggling prior to the pandemic hitting. Those families did not have a lot of resilience to begin with. And something like this, I think, has probably really had a key impact on their capacity and on the capacity of their kids. While I don't think people within the mental health field have focused so much on the impact of COVID on brain development per se, when they talk about the impact of COVID on mental health, I do think there's going to be a crisis of mental health for people. We're going to have to be thinking about part of the recovery from the pandemic being mental health supports, particularly for those individuals who were struggling prior to that, right? Those are going to be the groups of people that need the most intensive supports, but all of us are probably going to need a little bit of help because it's been a year and a half now. A year and a half is a long time for anyone to be socially isolated, to be struggling with some of these things. And the longer that goes on, the more it kind of dampens down everyone's capacity for it. So it's not a question with an easy answer, but this pandemic has absolutely, I think, affected all of us, but some more than others.
For sure, and I appreciate your thoughtful answer. Thinking of the next question, all of us have probably given advice to a new parent at some time or other. And those of us who have been parents have received lots of advice when a child was born. And one of our participants was pointing out that often that advice is contradictory. And they gave an example. For instance, one philosophy is, you've got to let a baby cry it out, because that baby's not going to learn to self-soothe, which is all so important, as we know, in terms of future development, etc. But then in contrast to that, traditional teachings would say that babies can't really communicate what they need in a nuanced way, and we've got to attend to them if they're crying. Based again on your work, what would you comment on that?
This is another kind of thorny issue that is, to a certain extent, not something that you can answer globally for all children. But generally speaking, when babies are young, they do not know how to self-soothe. It is something that is a learned behavior. It needs to be taught. And so I would say, doing this from a young age, and I know plenty of people who've said it's been successful for them. They did this, suddenly my kid was sleeping through the night. Oh, hallelujah. So you do hear these contradictory pieces, right? But I would say, do not let babies cry it out. As they start to get older, what you can do is, sort of see if it's fussing at night, if I leave them for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that, will they eventually calm down? But if they're not, there could be something else totally wrong, right? So you don't want to be leaving a baby to cry for long periods of time. And that interaction will help them to learn how to control their emotions. And they'll eventually be able to do it on their own. But this idea of, I would not support this idea of letting young babies cry it out. But I know it's, there's different practices that become kind of all the rage every once in a while within child rearing. I grew up in the 70s. I was a latchkey kid. Like it was, if your kid was old enough to get some food for themselves or something like that, you don't need a babysitter, right? And that's swung in a different way, right? Well, it's child abuse if you leave your kid home alone if they're, under 12 or something like that. So there are different trends that come out. And you know what? Hey, that trend worked for me, but I bet there was a lot of other kids who probably shouldn't have been left home alone as young as I was, and they probably were. So it's a little bit of an individual thing. You have to know your child. You have to be able to understand your child really well. But generally speaking, yeah, I don't think the letting kids cry for long periods of time is a good idea.
Well, someday we'll compare notes because I was raised under the Dr. Spock era. So, so we'll compare notes sometime, Nicole.
Yeah.
Nicole, how would you respond to the critique that this resilience-based approach is ultimately just telling families to be richer and more privileged? So that, yes, it may be reducing some stigma, as you pointed out in the takeaways around mental health and giving people a different way to understand, but does it not contribute to the stigma against families that don't have access to the kinds of things that you listed as characterizing, quotes, the good environment, the nurturing environment?
So I would say that this science to me is highly destigmatizing. So what we need to understand is that resilience is not sort of based on socioeconomic status, right? We do know that extreme poverty will limit people's ability to access certain types of things that we know are important for children. And we also know that people who end up at the very low end of the socioeconomic spectrum also tend to have, a lesser education, lesser health literacy, lesser whatever. So may not even be in a position to support their child quite as well as somebody who is maybe has a higher level of education, health literacy, or SES. But what we see is maladaptive child development and brain development occurring right across the spectrum. So just because you have a higher income does not mean that you are not going to undergo a high conflict divorce, does not mean that you won't be a substance misuser, does not mean that you won't have mental health issues, does not mean that you will never be incarcerated for anything. So I would see this as understanding how this science sort of fits in with the social determinants of health, and why we need to think about equity rather than equality. So it's not just about giving people equality of opportunity. We have to think about equity when we think about families. And to me, it's not stigmatizing to think that maybe we should be taking a universal daycare approach, right? Give everyone access to those high quality environments because, even though, yes, if you've got somebody who's very much at the low end of the SES status, they're more likely to not have maybe as much education, as good of a vocabulary, maybe not want to read as much. But you contrast that with somebody at a high SES who sponsors and brings in a nanny from a different country who can't speak English, who the parents say, we don't want our child learning your language. And so, you still have this deficit then in language and literacy potentially, because completely different, but different SES types of environment, but ultimately the same experience, right? So I think it's about, it's not about viewing things like substance use, things like mental illness, things like what is it, child abuse and neglect as being tied to low SES, because I don't think they are. They occur across the spectrum.
Thank you for that. And I'll just a plug that our next webinar in October is really looking at that social justice perspective of resilience as we continue this wonderful resilience series. So thank you for that comment, Dr. Sherren. Many of us just love twin studies, and we follow them. We read about them in magazines, everything from Canadian Living to Reader's Digest. And one of the questions that came in is, okay, so I think I'm following, the theory, but how do we explain identical twins raised in the same environment, and one develops what we would see as a resilient nature and positive executive functioning, and the other one doesn't? How would you explain that?
So this is where it's, again, that interaction between our experiences and our biology. So yes, identical twins have essentially identical DNA, but they don't necessarily have identical patterns of gene expression. And so gene expression, it turns out, is really critical for predicting outcomes, nor, quite frankly, will they have the exact same environmental experience. So part of that is a little bit how we might think about temperament. So identical twins, yes, the identical DNA, but temperament can also be influenced a little bit by that gene expression. You might have a child who's one of the twins who's more outgoing versus the other one who's a little bit more timid. And for anyone who does any sort of psychology research, that when you've got that dyad happening, if you've got sort of a bit of an extreme, those extremes can tend to get more extreme over time. So if I'm the twin and my sister's outgoing, then I'll let her take the lead, and I become even more sort of standoffish and timid, right? And vice versa. So first off, identical DNA does not equal identical gene expression. And having that identical environment also does not equal identical experience. How you perceive the environment is also important. So a child who is more timid might perceive the environment as a little bit more threatening and anxiety producing, and so not engage in activities that the other twin does. So it's more complex than just thinking that an identical twin has identical biology and identical experience. They actually don't. And what this means is that there are very subtle differences in the environment that can influence our biology over time.
Thank you. We had over 1,000 people participate in this webinar, Dr. Nicole Sherren, and we really want to thank you. And I just want to bring our question period to a closure by just something that I really believe with all my heart. And I think I heard that in your takeaway. We worded it a little differently, but it's early is better, but it's never too late. And I think while there is this focus on the early years, and there should be, I also heard and took very much from your takeaways the importance of intervening no matter what age a youth or young adult is, no matter what age the person is, period, at any point through life. And I think that I really wanted to end on that message that you shared with us today, and to thank you for coming and spending this time with us and sharing your knowledge as well as your experience. And just to remind everybody that the evaluation will be in the chat box, and please fill it out because it really helps us plan for future webinars. And to remind you that on October 19th, there will be the second webinar in our resilience series, and we hope you'll join us for that. And be safe, everybody. And thank you again, Dr. Sherren.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.